Korolos knew that true death was coming down the conveyor shaft, and he welcomed it like a friend he thought had long abandoned him. There was nothing to be feared in death. Only failure in life was to be feared. This he had learnt by bitter experience. Once his helm had borne the transverse centurion crest of an officer, but no more. He had been marked for greatness, serving first as the champion of the 178th Company, then rising through the officer ranks. Pride had been his downfall. Now, his helm was red with the mark of censure, the mark of his shame. He had woken after Synosia 4 to find it had been removed, a cobalt blue helm fixed in its place, but he had been insistent. "Your time of penance is past, old friend," Chapter Master Levianus had said. This was before young Aecus Decimus had risen to the post. "You carried that burden long enough. Too long. That fault is mine, and for that I am sorry. You've suffered enough." He would have none of it. His honor was forever stained, he said. He could not let it go. The red helm ensured that his dishonor was externalized, plain for all to see, and he would not hear of putting it aside while he still felt the burning shame that ate away at him. That could only be achieved in death. In the end, they had relented. He had yearned for this release for more than a century. He could never right the wrongs that he had wrought. He could never bring back the lives of battle brothers lost through his arrogance and hubris. But perhaps in death, he could go some way towards atoning for those mistakes. All his friends and comrades were dead. All those proud ultramarians that he had trained with in the academies of Armatura. All those who had been at his side as the Great Crusade pushed out beyond the edges of the map, expanding the domain of the Imperium. All his closest brothers, those he had laughed with, bled with, and killed with, all of them were as dust, gone, but not forgotten. At least not by him. Even the tough old war dog, Chapter Master Levianus, was dead and gone, his ashes entombed in the halls of Macragge, placed within a bronze urn at the feet of a seated statue of his likeness. Only he was left. He was not alone, not in a literal sense. The handful of legionaries around him, waiting with weapons trained upon the conveyor carriage doors, bore the same chapter livery that bedecked his own armored form. But he felt little true kinship with them. He had been old by the time they were inducted into the 13th Legion, a relic of the Terran past. They paid him considerable respect. They knew of his battles and triumphs, though he never spoke of them, and they bowed their heads when he walked the decks of the Legion's warships. But that only served to emphasize the gulf that existed between them. They revered him, but in doing so elevated him beyond themselves. There was no true brotherhood between them. How could there be? They could not relate to him any more than he could to them. The carriage reached the bottom of the shaft, and he clenched his immense powered fists, the servos and gears growling. A sheen of energy flickered over his colossal armored knuckles, and electricity danced between his tapering fingers. He crouched, ready to attack. Pistons groaned, gears turned, locking devices lifted. It was time to kill. And then, finally, it would be time to die. Korolos's memories of the early days of the Great Crusade were stark. Those dawning years had been proud, filled with hope and certainty. The doubts had come later. He remembered it so clearly. He could see the Eldar bladesmen before him, taunting him, drawing him on. The Xenos commander was a blur of movement, cutting through the Harkon Geno troops like chaff. They were chaff, just augmented humans of the Imperial army. He was so intent on killing the alien fiend had he been, so intent on claiming that honor that he'd become isolated from the main vanguard. He had 200 Ultramarines with him, cut off from the rest of the company, just as the enemy had intended. The keening screams of the Xenos haunted him, even now. The Eldar had fallen upon them from all sides, cutting them down with their exotic, deadly weapons, tearing through the ranks on scything jet bike attack runs, their screaming witches somersaulting through whole squads, leaving severed limbs and shattered dreams in their wake. He had lost more than just the 174 loyal sons of Ultramar that day, more than the additional 318 that had died coming to his aid. He had lost more than just his captaincy. He had lost the respect of his legion. He had lost respect for himself. Worst of all, he had seen disappointment in the eyes of his Primarch. That disapproval had cut him to the core, and it was a wound that would never heal. For 17 years, he wore his shame outwardly, fighting as a common legionary, with his helm painted red, seeking an honorable death in battle. Finally, it had come for him. On Senusio 4 he had collapsed, surrounded by a circle of slain foes, blood spilling from his lips. At last he would have peace. But even then, his trial was not yet done. The oblivion he craved was not to be his fate. He had fallen as Brother Aventine Koriol, but he had awoken again in an armored shell that he might live on. He bore his new name, Korolos, engraved upon his chest plate, yet his shame was not lessened in this new incarnation. His pain was as strong as ever. He had not yet done enough to atone for his misdeeds to be allowed the peace of oblivion. How could he ever atone? He saw the word-bearers before him now as grey, pixelated blurs. Blinking target locks identified them, and he processed the abundance of information delivered directly into his cortex in a nanosecond. The power levels of their armor, their heart rates, the clipped commands being streamed back and forth across their Vox network, the mark and place of manufacture of their armor plate, the model and threat level of their weaponry. Within the stinking amniotic fluid of his cramped sarcophagus, his atrophied claw-like hands twitched, and the immense power fists of his newer mechanical flesh clenched into fists. He vocalized his anger, shame, and frustration as he thundered towards them. While a few errant bubbles did escape his withered organic throat, the roar that blared from the Vox emitters on his carapace was the bellow of a beast of iron and rage.